And in this moment, it has not ever, I think, felt more urgent. Demos has been talking about how to improve democracy through collaborative and participatory processes for 20 years. And I think with each passing political era, it has become more urgent. And we were just reflecting before we started on the events of the last week and what we've learned about the state of global democracy, the state of trust in politics, and how political systems are changing. It makes this conversation about improving and refining and changing elements of democracy feel ever more urgent. In July, we published what we called the Citizens' White Paper, setting out why, what, and how participation in central government policy making can happen. And this conversation is really to mark both the work that went into that, but also how it's now being rolled out and worked with across government and with partners at the centre. So my job tonight is very happily just to say hello and welcome, and I'm going to pass over to my colleague Miriam, who's going to be leading events tonight.
Thanks, Polly. All right. So yes, as Polly said, welcome to this, which is the fourth in our series of Collaborative Democracy Network events. I'm really delighted that today we're going to be talking about how the civil service is doing participatory policy making and working with people who are going to be impacted by those policies and thinking about how that affects and changes the way that we do policy making kind of from within the civil service. I'm delighted that we're going to be joined by two senior civil servants, Susan Aplin-Hood from the Department of Education and Sally Warren from the Department of Health and Social Care. And they're going to be talking about the work that they're doing, their take on the government's appetite for this, and what they think some of the opportunities and challenges are that kind of lie ahead. What we're going to do, though, is we're going to frame that conversation around the Citizens' White Paper. So myself and Sarah Castell, the CEO of Involve, we're going to tell you a little bit about the Citizens' White Paper, the thinking behind it, the contents of it, so you've got a chance to kind of have that in your mind as we talk about kind of what's actually happening in the civil service now, kind of following on from its publication in July. So myself and Sarah will talk about Citizens' White Paper. Then I'm going to invite Sally and Susan up here to talk about the work that they're doing. And I've asked all of us to keep our bits as brief as possible, because we know there's going to be plenty of interesting questions that you've got from the audience. We want to give you plenty of time to ask your questions so you can hear for yourself, kind of to get a little bit more under the skin of what the work is that's happening. But before we get started, we just want to give you a chance to introduce yourselves. So I'm going to ask you to turn to somebody next to you or a couple of people around you, just say who you are and what brought you here tonight, just so you've got more of an idea of kind of who's in the room tonight. Well, I'm lovely to meet you. End. So hopefully you've got to know there's a few interesting people in the room that you're going to talk to. So with that, myself and Sarah are going to tell you a little bit more about the Citizens' White Paper. So just to start, to give you a bit of context as to why we did it. We often talk about why the government should involve citizens in policy making. Why is it important to bring people who are going to be impacted by those policies into thinking about what those policies are going to be? But we don't often move beyond and this stuff is important to how are we going to do it then? So we wanted to make sure with the Citizens' White Paper that we went beyond. So we've set out why, and we're going to talk a lot about why this stuff is important. But we also wanted to make it really easy for government to take this stuff forward. So not only what does participatory policy making actually mean, and how, if the government is serious about wanting to involve people in policy making, what are the steps they need to take to make that happen? So the paper takes you through from the why to the what to the how. You can read it. If you haven't already, I'm a little bit disappointed in you, and I kind of feel like I need to test you on it, but I'm going to forgive you. You can read the whole paper. Scan the QR code, you can download it from our website. But we wanted to start by thinking about, well, what's the problem we're trying to solve here? Is there a problem with the way that we do policy making now? So we had a whole set of conversations with ministers, with ex-ministers, with shadow ministers, with senior civil servants and ex-senior civil servants to ultimately like, well, what are the difficulties and the challenges with policy making now? And why do we need to think perhaps about a different way of involving people in the processes that are undertaken by policy teams across government? And the 4 problems that they identified that we kind of talk a lot about in the paper, firstly, there's the Whitehall bubble. It feels like the people who sit in Whitehall, and I speak as a former civil servant, so I'm a reformed person, I've been there, I've been in the civil service, I know what this is like. Actually, these rooms are they often feel very closed. And you're often talking to people who don't represent the diversity of the communities out there in the real world. And that makes it very difficult to come up with policies that are actually going to make a difference to people's lives. Another issue that they identified was that policymakers at all levels feel really disempowered. And there's something a little bit frightening about hearing from a really, really, really senior civil servant feel like they didn't have the levers to pull to make change. It's like, wow, if you don't feel like you have power, I'm not sure who does have power then. But everybody, from kind of the citizen on the street who feels like they don't have any control over the policies that are kind of being made in Whitehall, right up to the most senior civil servants, actually feel quite disempowered in the system. There was also an issue, they said, about when we do engage people, either stakeholders or citizens, it often feels like you're talking to the same people. You're talking to the usual suspects. And that's a bit of an easy shorthand, but there is a sense that it's very easy to reach people who you've already got connections with. And that's fine. And reaching those stakeholders is good and important, but it's very hard to reach beyond those into people who wouldn't usually have a voice or have a stake in the policies that are being made. And finally, they talked, and this is, remember, tail end of the last government, but political turbulence isn't conducive to long-term policy making, which I think we can all understand when the ministers are changing a lot, there's a lot of movement, that's very difficult to do long-term policy thinking. So we know the government's got kind of big challenges ahead. And Polis talks about it, and I know Sarah's going to pick up on this in a minute, but kind of the issues with a real problem with a trust deficit, that people out there don't actually have that confidence that politicians are going to make decisions in the best interest of the country. And this government has a huge amount of work to do to rebuild some of that trust. And there's delivering on promises, and there's upholding ethical standards, but there's going to have to be new ways of like taking the country through these really, really difficult decisions that the country is going to have to make, or the government's going to have to make, as we've just seen in a budget that's seen tax rises. These are really, really hard things. Like, how do we take people and communities with us, with government, on this journey, which will help to kind of create policies that are going to work for people and help to rebuild trust kind of in this system, which feels really important to kind of build these strong foundations. So what we're talking about at one level, involving people as one of those methods in order to kind of create best policies and rebuild trust, it sounds kind of straightforward on one level. Like, it shouldn't be that hard to talk to people. But on another level, it's one of the hardest things that a government can do, because they actually have to level with people about the scale of the challenges ahead. And they have to make clear that there are no easy wins. And actually, most solutions that you come up with aren't win-win. Actually, there's compromise. Actually, it's hard. Actually, some people are going to be perhaps a bit worse off before things get better. And that's a very, very hard message to get across to people, particularly when populists are selling there are easy solutions and like playing on that need that people have for like an easy answer and a quick win. So what we're asking isn't easy. It is asking government and policymakers to have those really, really hard conversations with people about the trade-offs needed in order to meet our hardest challenges, and taking people on that journey to help identify, well, what are the actual problems here and what are some of the solutions that are going to tackle them. So we want to make the case for putting citizens at the heart, kind of bringing their insights and experience and knowledge and collective judgment to bear on some of these really, really hard issues, to come up with solutions that are actually going to make a difference to people. Why do it? We think it's about improving policymaking and rebuild trust. It's about making sure that when policymakers are sitting in Whitehall and coming up with policies, that there's real world proofing. That it actually means that when that stuff hits reality, it's not going to fall over, it's not going to fail, because the people who are actually going to be impacted by that thing have been part of the process for coming up with what the answers might be. It's about stress testing the options to make sure that you don't have the fiscal or trust costs of failure and things don't work on the ground. It's overcoming divisive and toxic and difficult and challenging topics by bringing people together and finding that common ground, and building legitimacy and understanding where the real Overton window lies in people's sense of how they want to tackle a policy area. And it's about rebuilding trust, kind of rebuilding those foundations of our democracy. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who's going to talk more about kind of some of those ingredients that are needed to build a real participatory policymaking process.
Thanks, Miriam. Yeah, that's a good moment to hand over, because I was just thinking, oh, I can just row in behind Miriam there with lots of examples of all of those different principles that she just gave for how this works in practice, and how you actually do it. So the reasons that we wrote the Citizens White Paper, as Miriam said, we wanted to make it super easy. Thank you. We wanted to make it super easy for governments and for policymakers, for civil servants, to think about how you do this. So the paper has lots of examples in it. It has very practical tools of everything from what is a citizens' assembly, what is a deliberative workshop, what's different about co-design, and all of these different methodologies that people might hear floating around, and some of the theory behind it, the spectrum of participation that many of you I know will be familiar with, and maybe some won't, and also how much it costs. We've costed up a lot of big recommendations, and we've given a flavour of the cost of that sort of thing, and that seems like quite straightforward stuff, but actually when Miriam and I sat down to talk about it earlier this year, we just realised that although it was in our heads and in the heads of a lot of practitioners, it wasn't all in one place. So we thought that was a useful thing to be doing. I think at the time, it seems, I mean, before the summer seems quite a long time ago now. I feel like 2 weeks ago seems quite a long time ago to me in politics. But we wanted a blueprint exactly for how a new government could work in a participatory way, and how to engage public judgment on tricky issues, because I think that's the core to all of this. All of the different ingredients can be tweaked and done in slightly different ways, but if you want to sort of bake the cake and make it rise and taste delicious, you need there to be a public judgment element in this. There's a lot of ways of asking the public their opinions. Opinion polls are fantastic. Lots of different ways of surveying and hearing what people think. People's lived experience and following them and looking at ethnography, also fantastic and very, very useful. But if you really want to rebuild trust, and you want people to get over the problems that we're seeing in our democracy at the moment, you need elements of public judgment in your public practice and public engagement. And I'll just talk a little bit about that for a minute. Miriam has already talked about the trust deficit. But I think if we sort of take a step back and look at where the public is in relation to the government, I know this is civil service focused, but I think this is probably important as well. The government came in, said we're going to bring back trust and we're going to deliver properly, and we're going to change the rules, we're going to behave a bit better, and we're going to get stuff right. And they've started to do that, but there's been some bumps along the way already, and it's becoming increasingly clear that sort of just delivery and getting it right isn't going to be enough. So that idea of holding something and saying, we know how to do this and we're going to do it for you, just isn't working. So people are going to need to be done with rather than done to. And I think, just in the last week, I think there's an even bigger prize that's emerging for us to play for, which is about really the safeguarding of our whole democracy. If we look forward 4 or 5 years, I think some of the themes and threads that commentators have been talking about this week are really relevant to the way that we make policy and do government in this country. So the idea that, for example, the left isn't listening to everyday concerns and isn't connected enough to what people think matters to them in their lives, that's something that, it's a political idea, but it's something that's going to be very relevant to the way people come to engage with government and policy making. The right is offering solutions that are great for me and my family, but maybe don't allow people to engage with the longer systemic challenges and trade-offs that we have to make. And nobody really is producing a story about how those trade-offs can be brought together and weighed up in an adult to adult way. And I think these processes they're not the answer to everything, and it feels dodgy to say that they are, but there's something about these being a good start, and something that starts to break through those deadlocks. So I think the idea of in the paper we have a lot of examples of how these processes help people make trade-offs. So the Climate Assembly UK, which was a big assembly promoted by 6 select committees of the Houses of Parliament, and in that there were lots of examples of people weighing up what was going on around climate, learning about it, talking to people who had different views from them, and then being able to say, well, okay, this is the personal constraint I can live with, maybe increasing prices for frequent flights, that kind of thing, then this is where I stop, this is where I don't want to live with, and having that kind of much more adult to adult discussion about the issues. Bringing together polarized positions as well, that's something that this kind of work does really, really well if you do it properly. There was a really interesting piece of research that NatSen and UK and Changing Europe did. There was a big deliberation about the UK after Brexit, and some evaluation of that process showed that after deliberating, the people who were more staunch leaver moved kind of more into the middle, and the people who were staunch remainer also moved more into the middle. So there's this idea that that you can change your attitudes to something really, really contentious like immigration, or all of these things which are quite kind of values driven as well, through that process of deliberating. And so all of the things in the paper describe how to do that kind of deliberation, and how to make it work to have those beneficial effects. And I just wanted to say one more thing about some of the benefits of doing this work, that the idea of people wanting to be listened to, and that for me I think has come out a lot in the last week or so. Everybody feels they're not being listened to, and I think when you then start to bring in a policy making challenge, and you start from where people are and what they need in their lives, then people are more able to open up and deal with ideas that might not have been the ideas that they started with in the first place. And a good example I would give there is the wind farms idea. Onshore wind farms so toxic politically that they were banned for ages under the last government. There's a really good example in Devon of the a consortium in Devon ran the Devon Climate Assembly, and in that Climate Assembly, the people there, after deliberating, lots of people were very anti-wind farms. When they deliberated, they found what they could live with together, and they worked out, how should they bring onshore wind into their communities. They ended up with 89% of them in favour. But the critical bit was they really wanted the benefits, or some of the benefits, to go to the local area. And when I look at some of the challenges that are around now, around, I don't know, the future of farming, or indeed the future of energy, and how new roads and rail links and power lines are going to be built, I'm hearing some of those same arguments of people not quite seeing how their voices can be heard and the benefits to them and their local communities can be factored in. So I think I will stop in a moment on this, but I think the key ingredients that in all of these processes, whether they're a small panel, whether they're a community conversation, whether they're a huge citizens assembly, whether they're a incredibly fast moving huge program of deliberative workshops, they all need to have independent facilitation, balanced sources, the right amount of time, the right people in the room brought there and recruited and onboarded fairly and honestly, because it's not just about inviting people to come, it's about enabling them to come and feel comfortable coming along. And I know that there's so much work goes on behind the scenes of how to make that happen. It needs the right question. It needs a question with traction that people can actually have a say in, and that's one of the hardest bits actually. And it needs the right promise to the public that at the end of the process you'll go back to them, and somebody with the authority to make decisions will go back and say, this is what we're doing, this is how we've taken on board what you've said, and this is why. And I think those last two, the right question and the right promise, are the parts that until now have been really hard to get from our central government. I think there's some brilliant examples now, and the next two speakers, I'm sure we'll talk about them, of how that's changing a little, and how we're now able to get a much more a much more kind of agreed voice of that feedback loop, from the very top of government through to the people that are in the process. So I'm very optimistic about the next stages of all of this. But yeah, I will finish there. I think this government's announced a decade of national renewal and mission-led government. So the big question is, whose missions are they? Who's doing the renewal? What does that mean to everybody? How does everyone's voice get heard? And I think if we can crack that, then democracy will be a lot more safe and stable than perhaps some of us feel it is at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Wonderful. I'm just going to very quickly talk us through the 9 recommendations that we put into the Citizens' White Paper. So basically, the heart of it was this route map to, if you want to do this, government, these are the steps that you might want to take, kind of short-term, medium-term and long-term actions. They kind of broke down into two buckets. There was the ones which are kind of big public-facing kind of showcases of how you can do democracy differently, that really kind of like was a symbol, a signal to the public that we're serious about kind of building a different relationship between citizen and state. And then there's a series of actions which are much more internally focused to the civil service. It's like, what does everyday policy making look like, and how can that be done differently in a way that really involves the people that are going to be impacted by those policies? They're online. I'm not going to talk you through all of them. I'm just going to highlight a couple of them which I think are kind of most relevant to the conversation that we've got today. So the first one was actually about missions. And what we're suggesting is, like, if you want people to feel ownership over the missions and be able to put in their ideas and their thoughts, really identify, well, what do the challenges look like, what the trade-offs look like, kind of from our perspective as citizens, we suggested building a citizens panel to sit alongside each of the missions boards, so people can actually have a stake and a voice in that process. We suggested setting up a standing citizens pool, so when different departments and different teams want to kind of involve people, actually doing that is really hard. Like, people don't know how to get the people in the room. It's like, how can we make this as easy and as simple and as cheap and as quick as possible? We've suggested building like a big panel, like 2,500 people worth of panel that can be drawn off for different processes. So we make the job as easy as possible for civil servant teams so they could actually do it. And the third kind of big area that we talked about was creating or building on a central hub of participatory policy making expertise. Because like we said, like, one of the issues that civil servants, we had a big civil servant workshop where we talked to people about this, and they were saying, we want to do it, we're kind of up for it, but we don't really know how. We want to learn from the people that've done it before. And Policy Lab, there's Policy Lab right there, are kind of leading the way, and other kind of bits of departments are doing amazing work across the government, but actually it's not embedded everywhere. How do we build on the really good practice that exists and make sure that the learning and the knowledge sharing can kind of spread and network and diffuse across the whole civil service? We talked about kind of levers that might help some of that kind of diffusion of good practice, like training, building a culture of participation, building departmental participation units, kind of developing senior champions who can talk about this stuff. So that makes a massive difference if you've got people like Susan and Sally kind of championing this from the inside. It makes a massive difference. It's all on you, just to be totally clear. You being the champion. It makes a really big difference to civil servants at all levels to be able to kind of feel like they are empowered to do this work. We also talked about involving citizens in select committee work, in post-legislative scrutiny. And we talked about having independent oversight, kind of that final kind of like standard setting and oversight and evaluation of this stuff to make sure that it really embeds and has standards that everybody can say, yes, this is what good looks like, to really build and grow on that culture of participation throughout government. I'm going to stop there because I really want to make sure that Sally and Susan have like plenty of time to talk about what they're doing. But like I say, download the Citizens White Paper if you haven't read it already, and have a look at those 9 recommendations that we made, because hopefully if all those were to be followed, then we'd have quite a different policy-making process moving forward. So can we just say thank you to Sarah? You're coming back a minute. Just before I invite Sally and Susan up, we did actually want to ask your thoughts on kind of what you think the biggest obstacles and opportunities are around participatory policy-making in government. So if you haven't heard of this before, we're going to use menti.com. It is a very, very simple tool. All you need to do is go to www.menti.com and enter the code, or even easier, scan that QR code, and that will take you to a question. We would really, really like you to answer the first question, and Patty's going to give me a nod when we are ready to have the first question. But you're going to menti.com and you're entering the code 38085685. And if anyone's having a problem, give me a shout and I will maybe be able to help with technical problems. Maybe. There we go. Can everyone see that?
So I'm just going to move this down.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Everybody in? Do you think everyone's in? Give us a nod. If you're having any problems, please don't have any problems. I'm not really good at technical stuff. Brilliant. Right, in that case, Patty, could you load up the first question? Thank you. So the first question you're going to be asked is, in a word or a very, very short phrase, tell us what you think the biggest obstacles are to government doing more participatory policy making. You can submit up to 3 ideas, 3 responses. Yes, and for anyone online who can probably not see that too clearly, there's a lot of things coming up which are potential obstacles. The big ones that are, I'm sorry, what? Yes, it is 3808 5685. And if you're online, you can also be doing this. So the sort of ideas that are coming out, really big ones: money, like time and resources; fear, which I really understand is a massive obstacle. Like, it feels a bit frightening to start opening up these questions that even civil servants don't know how to tackle. And you're suddenly going, what, we're going to be really honest about the fact we don't know the answer. That is a really frightening idea. Political will, awareness, like actually understanding, knowing how to do it. Other pressing matters, civil service mindset. Maybe this is something that Sally and Susan can address. Lack of capability, fear politics. I think there's probably something quite real in there about Daily Mail headlines and being afraid of what those might say. Indifference, risk aversion, insufficient personnel. There's a lot. I think we can all agree there are many reasons not to do it. But I'm going to ask you to move on to the next question now, which is a bit more positive, which is, what do you think the biggest opportunities for participation? In 1 second, we're going to ask you what do you think the biggest opportunities are for participatory policy making in government? What impact could it have? What areas could it be used for? Again, the shortest, like a word or a very, very short phrase that might take you to, why would we do this? What's the win? If we kind of overcome some of those issues, what do we win if we do it? And for people online who might not be able to see that very clearly, there's a lot in there about trust, legitimacy, better policies, better outcomes, which is really lovely. That's about saying, like, yes, you can have better policy, but the real point, the whole point about doing policy making is to make a difference on the ground. If it doesn't actually make people's lives better, kind of what's the point? If we do this, that can make the difference. Building trust, cost savings, depolarization, building trust, reducing inequality, breaking deadlocks. Exactly, taking on these really, really hard, toxic, divisive problems and finding that common ground kind of between. Using collective intelligence, political engagement, better decisions. Thank you. I think, she says, hopefully, think we can share this after the fact. Can we share this after the fact? Let's assume we can share. Good, we can share this after the fact for people who've been here. But I hope that's it's good to know that there's a win here. And with that, it feels like a really good moment to invite Susan and Sally to join me up here so we can talk a bit more about the work that they're doing. I'm going to just kind of introduce them. I'm sure most people know who they are, but firstly, Susan Ackland Hood. Susan has been a permanent secretary at the Department of Education since September 2020. She's been a civil servant since 1999. Previous jobs include being Chief Executive of Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service, and Susan's held a range of jobs within education and justice policy posts, including in the Prime Minister's office at number 10, the Home Office, the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, and the Social Exclusion Unit. So I think it's fair to say that over the years you've probably built up an incredible sense of what goes on in government and how everything works. I'm also joined by Sally Warren. who is Director General, leading on the 10-year health plan, leading the joint Department for Health and Social Care and NHS England team. Prior to this, Sally was Director of Policy for 5 years at the King's Fund and has also held roles as Director for Social Care Policy at DHSC, Director of Programmes at Public Health England, Director of EU Exit Preparedness and Response at DEFRA, and Deputy Chief Inspector at the Care Quality Commission. So again, you've worked in health and around health policy for a very long time, and it's fantastically well where you are now. So, Susan, could I just start with you? Can you just start by telling us a little bit about the work that you're doing in Department for Education to do more participatory policy making?
Yes, definitely. So, I mean, I think there's a really interesting spectrum here, and you've talked a lot about the kind of full-on deliberative end, and there are some things we're doing that fall into that kind of category. So we're doing in case you missed it, we're doing a review of the National Curriculum and Assessment at the moment, and that's being led by someone called Becky Francis, and she's got a kind of big apparatus set up around her to both to take suggestions as part of there's a call for evidence, but you can respond to that in lots of different ways, and she's also running a set of regional roadshows to bring people together to talk about the options and opportunities that presents, and that's probably the sort of biggest see from space thing we're doing at the moment. I think the other thing I'm really keen on though is trying to make sure people don't see this as a sort of thing you can only do gigantic size or not at all. And there's a lot of it that's about encouraging people to think about how they can engage better in the normal course of business without seeking permission or kind of getting too hung up on it. And we host Policy Lab in DFE, so that's great. So we use quite a lot of Policy Lab resource. But we also try and just encourage people to think about the tools and techniques they can use, the way they can flex things that you would normally do to create a kind of a different way of doing things. And again, this is probably still slightly at the big end, but we produced a green paper on special educational needs a couple of years ago. Still a really challenging question, and the sort of question on which if you don't engage and get people to participate, you know you're not going to make progress. But it was 2022 we issued it, so we're doing a lot of the fieldwork in 2021, and it was quite interesting as we came out of the pandemic. I mean, the team didn't use a kind of methodology you'd recognise from the Citizens' White Paper, but they did have a truly enormous number of online webinars and opportunities for people to engage way beyond the scale that we would normally have done, partly because of the subject matter and partly because coming out of the pandemic we realised that we could do things differently and we could engage at a completely different scale. And we then created a kind of webinar in a box tool and basically said any team that's doing anything who wants to break out and create some different ways for people to engage, here's a way of doing it that doesn't need technology beyond the teams you've got on your desk and some kind of suggestions for how to make it work. Sorry. And then the other thing that we try to do again and again, I really do think the kind of full spectrum of methods for engaging people are important. So we've also used with Policy Lab things like film ethnography as part of the work on children's social care reform, partly because to the point about are you at risk of consulting or engaging the usual suspects, families with children's social care involvement, I think even through a kind of very well constructed deliberative route, it is going to be challenging to get involvement from a kind of good and representative sample of people who've got that kind of experience. So for that, again, we look more at going to where they are and living and understanding their lived experience, rather than trying to get them to come and be part of an experience we've arranged. And I guess I'd finish by saying I really do think that kind of form follows function principle is important. So there was only I thought that was a brilliant introduction. I really enjoyed this. This is about paper. I think there's lots of this we just need to do more of. But you gave me kind of one sort of moment of pause when you were talking about kind of how do we find the right questions for this kind of thing. And I think you always want to watch out when people are trying to find a way of using their shiny new tool which they like, rather than trying to work out what's the problem you're trying to solve and what's the right tool for solving that problem. So I think if we got to the point where we thought that kind of one particular format of this was the right thing for everything, it would be a strong sign that we got it wrong. However, there's quite a lot of things where at the moment we have a relatively limited toolkit, and we ought to be expanding it massively in this direction. So it is one of my aspirations as a senior civil servant that before my time as a senior civil servant ends, we kill off the traditional government consultation document. I think it's like the worst thing we do. It pretends to consult people. It only attracts the usual suspects. It's a colossal time, energy, and effort sink, and it adds no value. And I think it actually makes people cynical about other ways of engaging and consulting people. So I think there's something about not just form following function when we think about new ways of engaging people, but we should be trying to break out of the very traditional set of tools that we kind of reach for without thinking about it, and think much harder about kind of what's the problem we're trying to solve, what's the issue we're trying to grapple with, and what is the form of the engagement that best suits that challenge and that problem.
So music to my ears that you want to kill off the consultation form. That is a joy. Can we minute that? Can we make somebody record that? So
legislatively still a bit of a problem. But
yeah, but it's enough that you said it. It's a good start. Sally, DHSC has obviously just kicked off this absolutely massive £3 million worth of huge community engagement and staff engagement around the NHS 10-year plan. Can you tell us more about kind of what you're doing, why you're doing it?
Yeah, of course. So I completely agree with what Susan said about there's a spectrum here. This is unapologetically at the massive end of the spectrum. Now, that's not to say it's the only way to do public participation, but it's what we're doing here. So almost a kind of where to start. So the 10-year plan, the 10-year health plan, is the vehicle by which the government will attempt to deliver its health mission, which is around building a health service fit for the future. So that's both about thinking about how to overcome some of today's challenges in the health service in terms of performance, health outcomes and financial position, but also about thinking 10 years hence what's possible in terms of science and technology that would really change how health services look like. So a really, really massive question that will require the NHS to change. It will require probably every single person working in the NHS to change in some way, and it certainly will require patients who are engaging with their health and with the NHS to change. So given that kind of scale of difference and scale of change, it felt absolutely right to not be doing this in a traditional Whitehall knows best, let's sit in an attic and come up with some clever policy ideas and then wonder in 5 years' time while it hasn't been delivered. So the Secretary of State was very clear from the outset he wanted his 10-year plan done in a very different way, and he wanted it to be done through participation, really for three main drivers. One is to rebuild trust with the public and with staff working in the NHS. The second is to deliver better policy, a really strong sense that we think people working in the system, but also people using the system day in, day out, really have good insights into what's working well and what's not working well right now. And then we also a strong sense that if people are involved in shaping a policy, they're much more likely to be involved in delivering that policy as well. So a real hope that it would start to shift the implementation gap that we often have in public policies, and particularly in the NHS. So in terms of what are we doing, it is very, very large. So it's broadly an awful lot of public consultation and engagement, I should say engagement, not consultation, deliberation, and then a kind of set of activities with stakeholders and partners as well. So if I kind of go through each of those in turn. So the first is kind of mass participation through an online portal. 3 weeks ago, the Prime Minister launched change.nhs.uk. And that's a website that is intended to have people be able to share their experiences, share their thoughts, share their ideas, and also to be able to actually present ideas that they think might change the NHS. And you can interact with other people's ideas, you can vote them up, you can vote them down, you can add comments on them. So it's kind of building a bit of a community. In terms of scale of that, we're 3 weeks in. We've already had 800,000 visits to that site. We've had 400,000 unique visitors to the site, 50,000 survey responses, and we've got 7,500 ideas for improvements already, and that's 3 weeks in. So I think that shows just how much interest there is out there about being able to engage in policy. Alongside the mass participation, we are doing more targeted participation. We're doing public deliberative events, the first one of which is this Saturday in Middlesbrough, and we're doing one in each of the 7 regions. We're also doing engagement with staff, where we're having this side of Christmas 30 online events with staff, and then the other side of Christmas, once, as you know, the NHS has a bit of a winter issue where we're not going to be doing engagement in the height of winter, but after the winter period we'll also be doing staff deliberation there. We've been doing a lot of system engagement with the NHS, so a regional roadshow with all of the key system leaders right across our integrated care systems in the NHS to get their input into the plan, but also to get them to champion and advocate involvement of others. So one of the things we've done, you talked about a webinar in a box. We have a workshop in a box, which is kind of the same thing. And I think the bit that I really like about a workshop in a box, we're launching that next week, is we're not just launching the materials to be able to do it. We're launching the workshop, we're launching facilitation guides, but we're also, we have our delivery partner on board, Think's Insight, and Ben is at the back from Think. So I'm making Ben age a lot in the last few months with all of this, but I think he's having fun mainly. But not only are we doing a workshop in a box, we're also Thinks is going to be doing like drop-in sessions a couple of times a week over the next few months, to mean that people can not just pick up something from the website and go, oh gosh, how do I use this, can actually engage with the experts who designed it and deliver it to really understand how to make that work in their local context. I think that's a really, really important way to make this a very meaningful kind of cascade of we're kind of training the trainers, so to speak, or training the facilitators, which feels really, really positive. All of this activity comes together into a big national summit at the end of March, where we'll be trying to make those trade-off decisions, trying to think through, has the policy making process kept true to what we've been hearing through the public engagement and the staff engagement. So really, really exciting, but a lot of activity.
I was kind of going to come to that. It's like, how do you close the loop with people? So you've had 400,000 unique visitors to the site, all these ideas. How do you close the loop so people feel like their contributions actually made a difference?
Yeah, so some of how we close the loop will be during the process. So where people have signed up and given us their details on the website, as we are then kind of narrowing down our ideas and our thinking, we can go back to those individuals to say, oh, you answered this survey a month ago, we're now kind of thinking this issue, this problem, what do you think about it? So we can reach out and seek others. The national summit will again be people who've attended one of the other deliberative events, so we can look back there. So some of it will be where we can kind of, in effect, bring people into a next phase of decision making. And then some of it is about being transparent, to kind of be able to say, you said X, Y, and Z at these events, and this is what government has done as a result. This is where we could do what you suggested, this is where we haven't and why we haven't. So that sense of being able to give a really good account during, but also at the end of the process, about what we listen to. And I think also important to say that account not being, here's a annex of a document that is 57 pages long that nobody's going to read. It's like, actually, how can you use video? How can you use different kind of multimedia to mean it's actually in a format where the people who have given you the privilege of their time and their energy and their commitment, that they will actually be able to engage with that kind of feedback loop as well.
Thank you. Susan, can I ask, particularly in your role as Deputy Head of the Policy Profession as well as in DfE, what's your experience of the political appetite for more participatory policy making? Do you think there is an appetite, much of an appetite?
Yes, I do. I mean, I don't. I slightly don't buy the sort of it's the politicians that are the problem. I think sometimes it's the problems that are the problem. But I think, I've worked with lots and lots of politicians. They have different levels of appetite. It depends what the issue is. But I think fundamentally it comes back to this point about kind of trying to apply the right method to the right challenge. And just to say something about the kind of policy profession's role in all of this. So, and by the way, I know Tamara would have loved to have been here tonight as well. And she and I talk quite a lot about participatory methods in the policy profession. For those of you who haven't heard me say this a million times before, we talk about three pillars in the policy profession as we think about our standards for policy making: strategy, democracy, and delivery. Strategy starts with, have you got the right problem? Do you understand what it is you're trying to do? And do you have kind of data and understanding and methods to feed it? Democracy has traditionally been about kind of, do you understand the processes of government, the legislative process, how devolution works and all of that. But increasingly we're seeing the democracy pillar as much more about direct democracy as well as parliamentary democracy. And that is the pillar in which the policy profession does contain training in how to think about participatory methods. And again, policy profession unit sits alongside the policy lab. They're not the same thing, but they feed each other, and we're trying to kind of build that capacity as well. And then actually I'll just talk about delivery a bit. So people are sometimes surprised that the policy profession has a delivery pillar, because they kind of think maybe the ODP do all of the operational delivery profession do all of that. Fundamentally, if your policy is not delivered, it's just a piece of paper, and there wasn't really any point. And so we have to really embed delivery thinking in the policy profession and make sure that as policymakers, we're thinking end to end all the time. And I think I was interested in better policy coming up as the kind of, and better outcomes was better, but I kind of think better delivery is a really good reason to do participatory methods as well, because fundamentally, not just with your kind of partners in delivery, the system participants who you want to do something differently, but kind of at the end of the day, a huge proportion of government policy ends in citizen behaviour, and that's what you're really talking about. You know, lots of these other things are kind of, you know, waypoints. I mean, you know, not to preempt this massive exercise that you're doing, but the answer to the NHS's challenges is public health, and most of that is about how people behave. And so if you aren't engaging people in that conversation, you've missed the people who you need to act in order to change the world. So sorry. So the whole of the kind of policymaking framework, I think, kind of points you in this direction and supports that. And again, there's a lot of work going on both leaders teaching leader type events, but also kind of structured training that helps people to do this better. And I think, you know, by and large, there's quite strong political appetite for people to kind of come forward with different ways of doing things. I mean, I don't know whether you've had, I mean, again, I think you will sometimes get anxiety about doing mass participation on things where people can't see to the end. So again, that kind of slight, like, I don't know where this is taking me. In a weird way, I actually think applying this to the most wicked problems we have is the best way to go, because if you're not quite sure how you're going to solve it anyway, you might as well engage a much wider group of people and share that kind of collective wisdom. Or on problems where, I mean, I always used to think when I worked in the Home Office that the Home Office is a totally fascinating and brilliant place to work. I always used to think that it was the place where the kind of undeliberated straight answer you might get from a person on the street about what they think would work and what the evidence base was telling Home Office officials would work were the furthest apart. It's true across quite a lot of crime and criminal justice policy and quite a lot of immigration policy, and actually some of the counter-terrorism policy as well. And that dynamic makes it quite difficult, because people fear that what they will be on the end of is a kind of process in which the citizen voice says black, and they've got a whole load of kind of empirical evidence telling them white, and that's a bit tricky. But in a sense, if that's true anyway, you might as well try and take that through a deliberative process, understand it better, and try and build comprehension. And then I think the final thing to say is, I think there's a really interesting challenge about scale and purpose. So actually, civil servants are quite good at engaging enough people to tell you whether your policy is actually mad. It mightn't always feel like that, but my experience of the civil service is incredibly rare for people to make policy literally in a room with the door shut without talking to anybody. Spectacularly rare. So typically what they will do is go and test with people. There's a risk that they test with the same people too much. There's a real risk of producer capture. So there's a really strong risk that we talk to producers and not users or people who proxy for users too much. And again, a huge chunk of what we were doing courts when we were doing court forms, trying to get to the users of the court, not the lawyers who represented them, because although they represented them in some ways, on questions like should we try and make court processes simpler, their interests were not the same as the interests of their clients. So there's something about kind of, are we always getting the right people? But the number of people you have to talk to, even if you do it really well, to check that your policy is not mad and that you haven't missed something big, is astonishingly different from the number of people you have to talk to make lots of people feel like they were involved. So the number of times I go out and visit a school and I get asked, have you ever been to a school before? It's like, stunningly, as the Permanent Secretary of the Department for Education, I have. But also, like, do you ever talk to teachers about policy? Yes, we have a whole load of teacher reference groups. We've got lots of people we talk to. We change the membership regularly. We go out. We do consulting. Oh, I've never been consulted. And the proxy for do you consult people is you've never consulted me. There's a lot of teachers out there. So if the acid test of your policies, everyone feels like they've been consulted, you have to do something really different from the thing you have to do if what you want to do is check that your policy's not bad. And that's a big mindset shift. And I think both for civil servants and for politicians, that's why the purpose and the question is important. Because those, it's not right to say those two things are the same and are exactly aligned. And by the way, we should care about both. But there are some things where you're going at a pace, or you're doing a thing, or you're addressing a problem that means you want to frame and scale differently, and that's legitimate. And we have to think about that as we go through this process as well. So it's the horses for courses point again. But yeah, I've never met politicians who are kind of. I mean, politicians tend to be quite interested in democracy, astonishingly. So yeah.
I'd hope so.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit frightened if that wasn't true.
Yeah.
Can I ask about your experience of civil servants? I know they're also not a homogenous group, but what do you think the appetite is among civil servants to work in a different way, or build on the ways they're working?
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot of appetite, and again, I think some of it is about. I do think sort of some of the barriers around skill and understanding are there, and I think some of the same things I've just described would be in their heads around kind of, do I understand why I'm doing this? What do I do if I don't get, if there's a gap between the kind of deliberative answer and the thing that my evidence base tells me at the moment, and how do I kind of navigate and understand that? I do think there's time pressure, and I think there can be resource pressure, although I always inclined to push back on that a little bit, because although I think you need huge resources to do something at the scale that you're doing, and you couldn't do it on everything, I do actually think we've got, like with right mindset, actually we've got some amazingly powerful tools sat on all of our desktops now, that allows us to go further in that direction. And that's sort of my point about making sure we don't turn this too much into something where you have to do, where it's all or nothing. Because I think anybody working in a policy team on an interesting issue can think, how can I be more deliberative in the way that I go about this? How can I engage better? How can I think better about who I'm engaging and how representative they are? Can I just pick up a couple of tips from Policy Lab and organise my webinar in a different way that feels more engaging to people and brings more people together? And that's all valuable, right? You don't have to have done the perfect version for it to have improved your policy, your engagement, and your reach.
Thank you. Sally, can I ask, you've now embarked on this kind of really big engagement exercise, and it is going to run quite fast, kind of hitting a point in March. Can I ask you what you think the biggest risks are around this? What are you most nervous about?
Oh, everything.
Safe space.
Yeah, exactly. So you're absolutely right. It is a high risk process. So we've got a huge amount of political support and appetite for doing this. But we are going to have to make some really difficult decisions and some trade-off choices. And I think part of what becomes a real challenge here is the status quo in the NHS means that there are some, like in the loosest sense, winners, and there are some losers. But quite often, who the losers are is completely invisible to most people. So when you're then putting proposals forward and being clear about the trade-off, the losers become more visible, because actually you're almost deliberately making that the case, because you're recognizing that even now there are winners and losers. And that language isn't quite right for the NHS, but I hope you kind of understand what I mean, that you're creating more visibility. Now, we kind of know from the last few years that it's really difficult to have that dialogue with the public. It's really difficult to have that dialogue with the media. So the risk is that when we start to get to difficult choices, that actually some of the radical ideas get shut down quite quickly. So it's not that actually the whole point of this is you should let radical ideas kind of be tested and thought through, and kind of just lean into no decision is made until the decision is made, and not kind of take radical ideas off the table. There is obviously a risk that the kind of the overall environment means that doesn't happen. There's a risk that we really focus on, if you like, people and community-based engagement, and don't put equal effort into how do we engage with our stakeholders who would be a core part of how we deliver change and really need to be on board as well. So that sense of this needs to be balanced across all of the different, if you like, constituents we're looking for will be really, really difficult. And then there's just, you know, the classic Whitehall problem of we're trying to run this process sort of alongside what will be a spending review process as well. So how they feed each other in quite an agile and dynamic way is a that's just a bit of a headache for me to kind of work through, and hopefully it will work timing wise. But our friends in Treasury quite often just change their timetables, so we'll have to go with that. But yeah, so I think there are risks, but what I kind of reflect on so far, the political commitment to it's been really strong. So the first day the portal launched, I did have a few genuine head in hands moment where the ideas coming through on the portal, we were having it was the British public being voting at Voteface. And I was looking at some of the ideas thinking, I just don't know how Secretary of State is going to go with this. So we had, could there be a Wetherspoons in every single hospital? Could we have a dog as an NHS flag to kind of cheer people's mental health? And the favourite one was, could Wes be fired out of a cannon to raise money for the NHS? And when you are, and somebody had done some clip art of Wes being in a cannon, being fired out of a cannon. And when you think, how's he going to go with it? And he completely lent into it. He was like, for all, like, yes, of course, some journalists are going to have fun for 24 hours. Of course they are. It's really easy to have fun on this website now on day one. By day two, it was really, really great ideas. You could see the public engaging and debating with each other. And Secretary of State really led in to say, yes, there's been some jokey stuff, but the jokey stuff absolutely makes the really, really great ideas that we've seen really, really worth it. And I think that sense of kind of not running away from what could have been okay, yeah, it's been a bit embarrassing. There's too many fun jokes here. Let's kind of just like not lean into it anymore. So I think that kind of sense of still sticking with it was important.
Same question to you, Susan. What's your nervousness? What do you think the risks are about involving people more in policy making?
I think I've described some of them in earlier answers. I think the most important thing to say is that I think the benefits outweigh the risks, and we should find a way. Do you know what I mean? I suppose. I suppose there's something about. I do think there's something about how you do it to avoid. That kind of capture by the people who are most able to kind of operate and manage those kinds of process. So the kind of, I definitely had a nervousness about the kind of, again, love your white paper, but I had a nervousness about kind of have a standing citizens panel, because you look at that and think, who's going to be on the standing citizens panel? But is that really going to be a representative? Even if you use all of the tools you have at your disposal to try and make it representative by demography, it's sort of inherently going to contain people who really want to spend their time talking to government about government policy, and that may mean you get an inherently kind of skewed sample of people who are already relatively good at kind of managing their way around these systems. So I guess the challenge is it's not a risk that would suggest you don't do it. It's a risk that means you have to think about how you do it, which is back to that kind of, how do you hear the voices that we don't hear very well in the system at the moment? How do you disproportionately preferentially hear them? And the nice thing about kind of more constructed versions of this is that you do that kind of work to think about the representativeness of your sample, and you go and actively kind of recruit in that way. But I think again, there are some topics I can think of where I'd be particularly careful about that, I think, because they're prone to, so I'm thinking about VAT on independent schools, where the about 6% of the nation's children are educated in independent schools. I can tell you that quite a lot more than 6% of the traffic that we're getting is on this issue. And that is partly because quite a lot of people who send their children to independent schools are really, really skilled in using and communicating through the systems of government. And it would be great if participatory methods made that influence less clear. But I sort of feel like people will get wise to the new methods quite quickly. And so I think we just have to kind of watch that quite carefully.
I think there's really interesting ways to tackle that, because actually
I know.
yeah.
But I think we just have to keep.
Yeah,
checking.
definitely. And having a panel where you have to make sure that it refreshes all the time so people don't become mini civil servants, because that doesn't help anyone. That doesn't help you hear from kind of what the
Yeah, and it
really
goes
looks
back
like
to the
on
point
ground.
about what's your aim? Is your aim to inform your policy, or is your aim to make lots and lots of people feel as though they've been engaged in it? At which point having a panel is a slightly, like, might actually take you backwards. Do you know what I mean?
So if those are your risks, what are your ambitions? Kind of, if you can imagine kind of what the ideal place looks like in 5 years' time, sort of towards the end of this parliament, what would you want it to look like in terms of participatory policy making?
So I'd like it to look both like from a policy perspective that we are engaging more confidently and more routinely with a full range of ways to engage people, which won't always be the kind of full fat version I'm doing. But I think for me, the absolute critical bit then is also how does that legacy or that approach filter through the delivery system. So if I take the Department of Health and Social Care as an example, if Whitehall does all of this, but then actually it goes down to ICSs who are then working out their local plans or place-based partnerships, and they're doing it in a very traditional way, you've kind of lost the benefit of that. So what you really need is that sense of this is happening at kind of every level. So every level is having a different conversation with the communities they are serving. And we do see some really good examples of that. There's been some great examples in specific local public services where they've really wanted to have a different conversation and have been prepared to lean into that. What can sometimes be described to me as a risk is if you ask the public for what they want, you'll just get a really long shopping list of really expensive things, to which the answer is no, actually you don't. I mean, unfortunately, the public is very undemanding about its public services. I kind of wish it would come up with a massively long shopping list, but more often than not, it's a very well-informed debate about what's possible, what should we do, what the trade-offs are. So I think that sense of it's not just happening in Whitehall, things need to shift in Whitehall to mean it can happen, but you've got that legacy of it happening where any organisation is shaping public services, they should be doing that with the communities they serve and not to the communities they serve.
Oh, yeah. I think I really like that, and I think there's something. I also think there's something. I've thought. Sorry, I know this isn't a risks bit, but I've thought another risk, which is there is a risk that if we do this at scale. So I do think one of the things you do quite often get is that people will talk about their intimate lived experience quite a lot, and there's a bit of a risk of hoovering things up to central that should be local and devolved, which is why I really like your vision, which is kind of doing this at the right level, and that it's something that kind of everybody's doing at each stage. Because again, there's always that slight risk that kind of you do a big participative thing and it makes people want to kind of direct what happens in every GP surgery or every school because they think they know that. And actually, you're much better to think about how they create their own relationships and engagement. I think. What's my vision? I think my vision is that we get much more skilled at using a much wider range of. I mean, I think my vision might be the death of the government consultation document partly. It's that we get much better at using a much wider range of ways of doing this, and that we think really innovatively about what's possible. So I talked a little bit about how we, again, using relatively basic technology in a much broader way. But I think there are tools out there that people use. So there's a thing called Teacher Tap, which again, if you're in the education policy world, you'll definitely know about, which is a kind of daily survey for teachers. You do it on your phone. You sign up to Teacher Tap. They ask you one question a day and you answer it. And your sort of prize for doing it is that you get to see a bit more detail on other people's answers. So it kind of, fed by curiosity. That's producer focused rather than user focused, but it's a really interesting source of just very, very regular input on a whole range of issues. It's not particularly deliberative. It's a bit more kind of one question. But I'm quite interested in kind of what are the things that help people to feed their conversations more effectively into a bigger national conversation that allow a kind of wider range of voices to be heard and inputted. So I'm quite interested in, how do we embrace the set of things we are exploring here today, the techniques that you've been working on and developing, the things that we've got policy lab, but also how are we finding the next generation of those techniques, because it's continuously evolving, right? And we need to be we need to keep looking for the opportunities that make it lower friction, lower cost, lower risk, easier to do more of across a much broader range of activities.
Thank you. With that, I'm going to open up to you guys. I'm sure you've got many questions for Susan and Sally and Sarah and anyone else beginning with S that you would like to invite to the panel. So do you want to come and join us back up here? I'm going to take some questions. We'll start with like 3 at a time. If you've got a question, put your hand up. If you could start by introducing yourself, keeping your question brief and actually question-like and not really grandstanding, that'd be fantastic. Yeah, who's got a question? One here, one here. Anyone else got a question? One here. Brilliant. Gonna be taking one of these.
What was it? Sorry, can you raise your hands again?
Yeah, so this lady at the front here.
Hi. Hello.
It's not actually,
oh.
just so people online can hear you.
Oh, okay. So, hi, my name is Rebecca. I'm a researcher at the Department for Education. Susan, you talked about voices we don't hear so much. Question to you, but also the whole panel. What are the opportunities to engage young people, in particular under 18s, in particular at the kind of pointier end of the deliberative democracy, deliberative approach, that end of the spectrum?
We'll take 3 questions at a time.
Where am I going?
Have the hand up, gentlemen. Sorry, gentlemen.
Hi, my name's Kieran Cummins. I work at the Centre for Deliberation and Arts. This has been great. Thank you. Really interested. The point you're making, Susan, about that with the standing pool and the example with VAT at private schools, I thought was really interesting, and how it sort of dovetails with, I guess, some of the barriers to participation that aren't necessarily about the things that are about participatory democracy or deliberation and so on. They're wider kind of issues in society, and I'd be really curious to know from everyone on the panel what they think are things that maybe affect people being able to take part in this stuff that isn't to do with democracy or isn't to do so with the right design or participation of citizens' assemblies, but things like, we only have time off for public duties for jury service, that kind of thing, or inequalities more widely. Yeah.
Thank you. And lady just in front of you.
Just in front.
Coming this way. Grey cardigan.
Thanks. Hi, Laurie Moulton, just concerned citizen. I'd be curious if if you're aware or of the experience in Taiwan and the use of polis, and if that is something that you're working with as well, which I realize isn't just it isn't deliberation, but it does allow for, identifying consensus of opinion. And also a follow-up for Susan. And it sounds from what you said, you have built it into some degree in terms of engaging the public with those trade-offs as you're coming to where the rubber hits the road, in terms of, so if people feel not just their opinions were, but that they're also confronted. And I do think the citizens also have to grow up, take more agency and responsibility. It isn't just the policy and strategy being effective. They also have to help it become effective.
Brilliant. Thank you. So it actually feels, thank you, quite neatly that it breaks down between each of you. So we've got time to get another round of questions in. So I think the first one, Susan, was particularly addressed to you around kind of involving young people. So I wonder if you want to pick up the question about kind of what are the barriers to participation, kind of what stops people being able to actually take part in these processes. And I wonder if you want to look at both kind of polis, because it's not dissimilar to what you're doing on the online platform for the NHS 10-year plan, and also around trade-offs. And then if you've got other things you want to mention as part of the questions, please do.
Thank you very much indeed. So and you'll know some of this because you work in the department, but we've obviously got a young people's panel which we use for regular questions, but also we can change the questions around. We also have a parents panel. We've done quite a lot. So the Children's Commissioner also does quite a lot on kind of large scale, both kind of so she did a huge exercise when she first started, which I think was one of the largest exercises ever done, seeking children's views on a quite wide range of questions about their experience of the world. And she also really deliberately and consciously went and sought the voices of children who might not normally take part in those exercises. So incarcerated children and young people, children in contact with the care system, and and again, we've used, again, she has used panels and thinks really carefully about how she changes the children on them, and we've been trying to make sure that that's kind of available to the wider department. So both the outcomes of the work she does, but also access to her kind of facilitation. And then again, just trying to make sure that there's kind of a whole range of ways, big and small. I have a stakeholder group that meets monthly. It actually started in the pandemic as a way of getting schools reopened in that kind of March 2021 period, when we met weekly and we mainly focused on school reopening. But right from the beginning of that meeting, we've always started every meeting we do with a slot, which is the voice of the child or young person. And a member of the group will bring, so we sometimes do it with actual human children in our meeting, which is excellent. We've had all sorts. We had Sixth Form Colleges Association brought art from their art exhibition to talk about how children and young people were feeling. So we do it through kind of like really wide range of mechanisms. And some of that is just about kind of keeping us focused on kind of what we're there for and who we're serving. And then the other thing I was going to pick up on was the latest bit of video ethnography work we're doing at the moment is on the opportunity mission, and that's deep embedding and following 8 families of children and young people in deprived areas of the UK, and again kind of spending time with them, starting from their lives and then using that to inform. And again, that's partly about recognizing that for them there would be a whole set of barriers to taking part in quite a lot of the types of event that we discuss and talk about. And indeed, they talk about those barriers in the video. I literally was watching it earlier on, and they talk about the barriers to kind of, going anywhere that's not school and home because of cost, because of anxiety, even if there's an offer to meet your cost, never quite being sure what the boundary of that would be like, and so on. So.
Thank you. This is fascinating hearing about the children and young people work. It's reminding me of we did a wonderful project a couple of years ago, which was around young people with learning difficulties and all sorts of neurodivergence. Asking them to design the SEND school of the future, and whether it would be something.
Got a SEND Kids panel.
Yes, and there's something there about. I think this starts to shade into answering the question about what the barriers to participation are, because I think I'm starting to realise that the barriers to participation for people who you might think would have huge barriers are actually the same sort of barriers as for everybody, and you have to apply the same lens to everyone, which is about what can people manage, what's their normal. When you said about coming to, can people go anywhere that's other than school and home, some of that is very practical barriers, like is there a bus and can I afford it, but some of it is a cultural or a human barrier around, do I feel comfortable there, will I be heard? And I think I think I said when I was speaking earlier about the kind of unsung heroes of the process of people doing lots and lots of work behind the scenes. We have a huge onboarding team at Involve, who are people who spend their time phoning up people and going around to see people and taking people laptops so that they can get online and get sitting with people and their grandsons so that their grandson can help them, and saying, who do you want to bring? Can I get you a taxi? How are we going to get from the station to the place where this event is? Sending photos and pictures of what the venue looks like and saying, this is where you'll be. Here's Miriam, she's your facilitator, she's the person to speak to. So very, very detailed, as lovingly as you would probably do with your own family to try and get someone to come somewhere. And it has to be done in this quite artisan by hand way. And I think that's the case. I really like what you're saying about the scale of things. Obviously, the scale is proportionate. If what you're doing is a very light touch panel with people who are quite happy to come and engage, you can help them into that level. But if what you want to do is bring people in who aren't going to be heard, my favourite story about this is when we were doing our People's Plan for Nature project, which was a really big project about the future of nature, sponsored by 3 big charities, and we had a huge citizens assembly with 100 people, and they all came to Birmingham, and the charity said, understandably, this is about the future of nature, all the food needs to be vegan because we want to show that these are some of the things we need to think about, and it will help people talk about the issues. And we eventually said, let's do that for the last one of the several weekends. Let's not do that for the first one, because there are people coming who might never have stayed in a hotel overnight before, and giving them a sausage and bacon at breakfast rather than something that they didn't not like or didn't know what it was part of them feeling that this was a place for them. And I know it sounds silly and it sounds patronizing as I say it, but it is about putting yourself in the shoes of other people. And then the other really big answer is money. You cannot not pay people to take part in these things, and you can't give them vouchers or ticks or
Amazon points or something. You've got to give them actual money, and you've got to look after their children and make sure that they feel okay when they come.
Great, thank you. So on trade-offs, Lauren, so yeah, absolutely, our process does design that we're talking about trade-offs with the public and with staff, and then when they all come together, we'll do that. So to kind of give an example, one of the trade-offs we want to talk to the public about is almost kind of which types of patients should GPs prioritise their time on as opposed to the time of the rest of the clinical team in primary care. So should it just be everybody is of an equal priority on the kind of waiting list or the 8 a.m. scramble to see a GP, or should we be saying if somebody has a particular complex need or if somebody is having a particular crisis, they should be higher up the list for GPs or they should get longer appointments? And that obviously means if one person's higher up the list, somebody else is lower down the list, and is that right? So we are designing trade-offs in as we go. I'm less familiar with the Taiwan model, but I suppose what I'd reflect on from our perspective is we deliberately have different parts of our kind of what the engagement looks like. So we have mass participation, which is important and valuable, and then we have deeper deliberation because we know some of the issues require a longer conversation, more provision of information. So our deliberative events, we have a 2-hour, if you like, warm-up session in advance where people get information, lots of videos from experts. We then have a whole day where we're with people, and no matter how good our website is, people are not going to be giving us 8 hours on a website at a time. So it's kind of different methods for kind of slightly different outcomes that we're trying to achieve in terms of reach, engagement, but then depth of kind of thinking.
Just want to say one thing about Polis, which is yes, I am familiar with it, and I've read quite a lot about it, but also Policy Lab use Polis quite a lot, and we relatively recently did an event for all perm sex and DGs across Whitehall where we deliberately used Polis for something they were talking about, partly because it's a good tool and partly so they'd seen it being used.
Brilliant. Thank you. A few more questions. So
In a second round.
I know everyone's all feeling confident now. I think it's brilliant. Gentleman at the front, gentleman at the end, and lady at the back. Great.
Good evening. My name is Mike, and I'm the UK associate for an organisation called the Consumer Choice Centre.
So can everybody hear?
Okay. Yep. Mike.
You might want to stand up.
Okay.
And or shout.
Oh, I see. And shout. Oh dear. Okay. My question is primarily about the role of participatory democracy in decentralization and how useful that would be, particularly for education and health. And I'm going to sneak another one quickly in, and talk about the importance of government reform first before allowing participatory democracy, because I think it's very hard at the moment to teach consumers, to teach citizens about how complicated government is at the moment and how the different things we can do to enable consumers to have their say in the system. So where does reform come in that before we actually get people involved? I mean, I struggle to get people on select committees or on public bill committees to discuss their personal experiences, and that's for me, let alone the average Joe on the street. So interested in that. Thank you very much.
Evening, Simon Garnett, enthusiastic amateur. Sally, Susan, really interested to hear the response from other civil servants and politicians for the spectrum of participatory democracy. You've talked about spectrum in terms of scale. I guess my question is around spectrum in terms of point at which you are asking people, because clearly there's quite a big difference between, are you seeking to understand a problem? Are you seeking inspiration of new ideas? Are you looking to refine those ideas? Are you looking to validate them? And I'd love to understand where you see differences in that level of enthusiasm, and what role psychology starts to play in perhaps any differences that you're seeing there.
Thank you. And there was a lady right at the back.
Thanks. Hello, I'm Lucy. I work at Thinks, the team delivering the 10-year plan work with Sally. I'm also a fellow at Lancaster University where I work on citizen participation. And my question is for you guys as civil servants. One of the things that we're interested in as a research group is what deliberative and participatory practices look like, not just between government and citizens, but within government. So I'm interested in your reflections on how having built in these practices and ways of thinking and working and being in your relationships with citizens, that does or doesn't influence your ways of working with each other, with politicians, as civil servants? Whether you think there's a kind of need for those two things to happen in parallel?
Amazing, thank you. Okay, so we've got 3 questions. One about the role of participatory democracy and decentralisation. And there's a question there about, do we need to reform governments before we start involving people? Where in the policy cycle are you finding that you have most enthusiasm? And actually, so as I want to build on that question and find out if there is a difference in terms of civil servants and their appetite for doing it at different points of the policy cycle and or politicians. And lastly, what do deliberative and participatory processes look like within government as opposed to between government and citizens? So, Sally, do you want to kick off?
Kick off. Great. All really, really good questions. So I think on decentralisation, I completely agree, because I think part of what doing participatory democracy helps you really think through is that we don't hold all the answers in Whitehall. You can help create the frameworks that support the right level to be taking on the right responsibility and making the right decisions, but you don't have to hoard everything centrally. So there's something about using participatory democracy to give the centre the confidence to let go, because you think there's the skills and capabilities to kind of lead differently at a local level. So I agree on decentralisation. I wouldn't say that you need to reform government before you start doing this, partly because I'm not quite sure what that would mean. I think it would take 100 years and then we wouldn't get parliament. So I think just you start where you are, don't you? And it's never perfect. You never have all of the perfect kind of context in which you might want to try and do it, but you kind of start. The point at which I would be wanting to put this into the process, I think for it to feel really genuine and true, the earlier you can be doing that, the better. So this isn't a consultation. This isn't I've got an idea and I'm just testing it with you. It should be, this is, I think this is the problem. Is this your interpretation of the problem, or is this something else actually? Is there something else causing this that we're not seeing? So it should be really early at the start, and then you keep kind of doing it as you go through. And then finally, your question about within government, it's a really interesting one actually. I hadn't quite thought about it, but sort of on the spot, I think what it would hopefully make me do as a civil servant is almost to apply some of those principles. So I think sometimes in kind of white cross government working, you can kind of, it can feel a bit like everything will end up in the right round process, and it's a bit of a kind of, how many changes will they ask for at this stage, and can we draft our way around the problem, as opposed to saying, did we get together early in the process and understand what the problem was and understand our different perspectives and then kind of work it through? So I think there's something about how meaningfully you can kind of have a shared understanding of the problem and a shared understanding of what the trade-offs are, because quite often with these wicked problems, every government department has to change a little bit, and they might not want to, and it might be easy for them to say no because it's really your problem, Susan, and if I just don't do anything, I don't really feel the problem. But that sense of, can we share the problem and can we share the kind of consequences, I think important.
Thank you. I won't repeat lots of very wise things Sally says that I totally agree with. I mean, I think the that point about kind of what's the relationship with devolution? Does this help you devolve? I think I would still say the critical thing is that you're kind of having the right deliberative conversations at the right level, and that you've got a match between the people having the conversation and the people who've got the power to make the change. So in a way, I think it's neutral to it. I mean, I think there's lots of other reasons that you decide what to do at what level in government. I mean, I think we should all keep reforming ourselves all the time, but I tend to agree with Sally that if you say one kind of reform can't happen until another kind of reform has happened, there's a bit of a risk you don't get any of it. And it might drive some change as well, which I think would be a good thing. And then on deliberative methods internally, I was thinking about this, and it's really interesting because I started off by saying, oh, I don't know, and then I thought about it and thought, I mean, I've done quite a lot of this when I've been doing organisational change. So if you're and it's that thing about kind of if you're going to change something that's fundamental to how people kind of show up and do their work every day, it works much better if you stop and engage them in it. So I was leading a lot of change in the courts and tribunal service when I was chief exec there, and we had again, I'm not sure it was the best name, but we had a thing called One Conversation, which was in fact lots of conversations, which is why it might not have been the best name, but regularly through the process of change, we asked every line manager to
run a session with all the people that they led, which had a kind of combination of a bit of kind of top down, here are the things we want you to cover and here's some help for you in how to do it, a bit like your kind of workshop in a box, but also a really clear method for that to feed back up into the organization. And then we did quite a lot of kind of, you said we did show and tell, and so it was there was something about kind of creating a shared language and giving people an opportunity to kind of feed into that process that was affecting them. There's something we've done in the department which again really interesting. I don't think I would have automatically described as this, but then I thought about it when you were talking about kind of have we stopped and thought about this together before we get to the kind of stage of having big write rounds. And inside the department we're running a piece of work called clearing out the clearances. So we do quite a lot of work, again, those of you civil servants, this will be familiar, those of you who are not might sound completely mad, but quite a lot of the work we do, somebody will write a thing, a paper, a consultation document, a proposal for ministers, and then hundreds and hundreds of other people will comment on it endlessly. And then there'll be a process of clearance where it will go to the kind of next person up in the chain and they'll have a view, and then it will go to the next person up in the chain and they'll have a view, sometimes different from the person one layer down. And and it goes through these kind of layers of clearance and up to the minister. And we said, well, we really ought to get to the point where there's one person who writes the thing and one person who clears it. And you do still want to consult lots of other people, but you want to be really clear what their roles are and that they don't all have a veto on every bit of it, but they do have a voice. And that's been really interesting. And part of the clearance processes was about saying, and don't bloody write the thing until you've had a conversation with the people who are really invested in it and really care about it. So don't start with a draft and then operate through kind of clearance layers. Start with a conversation and try and thrash out the most difficult issues, which you are otherwise going to have people trying to fix by editing your drafting to and fro. And that I think is, again, just conceptually quite interesting. And then I was just finally going to say, I mean, in conversations between departments, I think it's really interesting. I actually think we have, between departments, we have quite good mechanisms for sorting things out when we fundamentally disagree. Like, it's not always comfortable, but government has developed quite a good range of kind of mechanics for saying kind of, this department thinks X and this department thinks Y, and first we get together in this way and then we try and sort this out, and then ultimately, somebody, economic domestic secretary, the cabinet office get engaged, and then if they can't decide, the prime minister decides. Like, we all know how that works. Yeah. And because you know how it works, you usually fix it before it gets anywhere near that, right? Because the ones we really struggle with are the ones where broadly we agree on the direction of travel, but the thing is priority number 2 for me and priority number 753 for Sally, and then you just have lots and lots of conversations where everybody goes, oh yeah, I'd really like to help you, but I just can't this week. And those we have fewer good mechanisms for resolving. And actually I don't know that deliberative process is the answer to those, because it's not about resolving a fundamental difference of view, it's about managing prioritization. Yeah. Yeah, I've loved listening to all of the contributions here, because I agree with all of them, and all the things I was about to say have already been said. So I will try and just magnificently sum things up if I can. I think that we should remember that not all participation and participatory policy making is deliberation or deliberative, and not all deliberative work is necessarily participatory, and there's so many different kind of nuances to it. And I think what we've said around things being at the right size and scope and kind of question and kind of audience and kind of decision making level for the kind of problem that they are is absolutely the critical part to this, and I think you've articulated it very well. I think in terms of then the aspect of where in the policy making cycle should you be asking things is also, I do love doing the big kind of upstream questions, and I think they have huge sort of potential to, they've probably got the biggest potential to do the big trust building, grandstanding external things, but they're not right for everything and they shouldn't be used for everything. As I know no one's saying that they should, but we should remember. And I think the devolved power is really, really important in this as well, because that's what gets people on the street, not just sort of doing the kind of getting in the back of the taxi and going, well, no one's asked me to participate, or buttonholing you when you go around to an event and saying, why have you never spoken to any teachers? Because I've never been spoken to. So there's that feeling of what pervades the culture, and sometimes you need the big things to help pervade the culture so people believe they're in a participatory culture. And sometimes it needs to be, was I included in the discussion about what happened at my leisure centre, and how it was, this is a very local government kind of question or decision, or when they closed the street for my school street, when they came along and told me about it, did they actually give me a real input into the decision, or did they just tell me about something that was pretend and that had already been decided? This has happened in my street. I'm not bitter about it at all, but but it was very interesting as a member of the public, feeling wholly disempowered by a fake consultation process on a very small scale, and it made me lose faith a bit. And I'm probably pretty much sold on, the value of participating in your local democracy. But I think what it all comes down to, probably the biggest question is this idea of a relational leadership being the model now that we have in government and in local government and in corporates, in all sorts of spaces, that you're not just saying, I'm going to make all the decisions and I'm going to suck all the answers out of you, and then I'm going to make my choice and decide what's right. You're always in relation with people. So whether you are having a one-off event with them, or whether you're thinking, I am the borough of so-and-so, how do I engage my citizens in an ongoing way to create the vision of how we all want to live together, then you still need that kind of relational approach, and not shying away from people. And I think that's what gives you then that confidence to be in the grey a bit more, to not need to know to the end of every process, but to know that you're going to be in relation with these people for a long time. And so then the process, every conversation is part of that longer relationship about working together. And I think where that's done well, it seems to make everyone feel very, very calm and happy. But it's really, really hard to get it right, and it's quite scary as well sometimes.
And on that note,
sorry, that's not a great note to end.
It's a bit scary. But I think what we've heard tonight is that it is eminently possible. And when you've got kind of people leading the charge, like we've got in Sally and Susan in civil service, actually it makes a massive difference to show what is possible. It's not so frightening. It's not so hard. It can be done. And the difference it makes, and the value that it gives both to people who are participating and to the policymakers sitting in government to actually come out with stuff that really works for people on the ground, I think the wins are all there. So with that, I'm going to ask you to please give our amazing speakers, Sally, Susan and Sarah, a massive round of applause.